Hello, and welcome to a discussion on the graphic edition of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. I am Anna Scheumann, 3GNY board member and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. On behalf of 3GNY, 3GNJ, and 3G Philly, it is my honor to welcome you to today's discussion. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. 3Gs are often the last living link to survivors and their stories. Through our flagship initiative, We Educate, our trained speakers visit classrooms in person or virtually to tell our grandparents' stories. We are actively combating the statistics that show a staggering lack of Holocaust education. Through storytelling, we teach diverse communities about the perils of intolerance. We are working towards building a generation of upstanders. Any educator can request a speaker directly from our website. Today's conversation is with illustrator Professor Nora Krug. Unfortunately, we will not be joined today by author Professor Timothy Snyder as originally intended. His publisher sent the following message. Regretfully, Tim will need to bow out of the conversation. As you may have seen, he's been an essential voice in the conversation surrounding Ukraine and has been overwhelmed by a number of urgent requests to lend his guidance and expertise. So now please let me introduce the illustrator of On Tyranny. Professor Nora Krug is the author of the graphic memoir Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home, which was the recipient of a National Book Critics Circle Award in Autobiography for 2018 and an associate professor at Parsons School of Design in New York. She was named Illustrator of the Year by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2019. Her drawings and visual narratives have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde Diplomatique. Her short-form graphic biography, Kamikaze, about a surviving Japanese World War II pilot, was included in editions of Best American Comics and Best American Non-Required Reading. But let's focus now on tyranny. So for survivors and descendants, this book really provides a context around our family's personal stories and really eloquently puts into word and picture why we are scared now and answers one of the most common questions that I get as a We Do speaker after telling my grandfather's story, which is, how can this happen and what can we do about it? Now, these questions are always relevant, but the need to answer them is currently quite pressing with the war in Ukraine. We are seeing tyranny in action as Putin leads an invasion into a sovereign nation. In light of that, I feel we have to start today with talking about the Holocaust inversion that Putin has used when he, a dictator, has said he's denazifying Ukraine. Something that is particularly disturbing for this community because President Zelensky is a Jewish man who descends from Holocaust survivors. So, Nora, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. So can we just start with some of your thoughts on this and the war in Ukraine in general?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you also for the very important work that you do as an organization, and thanks for everybody for attending tonight. Obviously, I find it hard not to focus on anything. I find it hard to focus on anything other than the crisis in Ukraine. I follow the news, hourly. It's just deeply disturbing what's happening there. It's reminiscent of many things that have happened, in Europe in the 20th century. And as you mentioned, Putin's choice of words is very ill-informed and ill-chosen and dangerous. And we mentioned before we went live that just a few days ago, Babin Yar, the Holocaust memorial site, was bombed in Kiev as well. So it is very, very disturbing what's happening there at the moment.
Yeah. Can you speak to the personal connection that you have to the Holocaust?
It's a difficult question. The book that you mentioned, Belonging, is a book in which I try to confront my own German family's past under the Nazi regime. I didn't know anything about my grandparents and larger family's perspective under that time because I was 8 years old by the time that all of my grandparents had died, and it was too late for me to ask those questions that were very present in my mind later on, as soon as I started learning about the war and the Holocaust in school. So the book was an attempt of trying to confront the truths, confront those gaps that had arisen due to the fact that these narratives were basically not existent in our family, not because my parents didn't want to talk about them, but because they themselves didn't know anything about it, because their parents had never talked about the subject. I went to archives, I talked to people who knew my extended family when they were still alive, and tried to put together a picture of my family's political views, and found out some aspects about my family's life that had been unfamiliar to myself and my parents, and that came kind of as a shock to us.
So as Holocaust descendants, we deal with intergenerational trauma, and you and a lot of citizens of Germany or descendants, from that time period, deal with that in a different sense, through inherited guilt. I had a German roommate for a brief time, and I didn't know her very well when we moved in, and she saw me lighting the Hanukkah candles, and she asked me, you're Jewish, where's your family from? And I told her, and she just started apologizing to me. And it's like, well, thank you, but why are you apologizing to me? You didn't do anything to my family. So is that, how do you feel about inherited guilt?
I think for a lot of Germans of my generation, I mean, of course, it depends on what family you grew up in, which state you grew up in, whether you went to school in West Germany or East Germany. I think there are many factors that play into this. But a lot of Germans I know of my generation grew up with a sense of shared inherited guilt, because we learned a tremendous amount about the subject in school. In my case, it really led to a sense of paralysis and cultural disorientation. Along with the inherited guilt came this feeling that we couldn't take any pride in any of Germany's cultural achievements that existed long before the Nazis came along. So it was very disorienting in terms of knowing who we are as Germans, who we are allowed to be, who we should be, who we shouldn't be today. And I think these are still questions that are really in the minds of many, many Germans, even if they're not aware of them. And one thing I did notice when I embarked on writing my book Belonging, however, was that the way that we had learned about it remained very much on a collective level, on an institutional level. And it's a very important level, it's a very important thing to do, to memorialize as a country, as a people, as a government. But I think what was really missing was the personal confrontation. So we never really asked each other what our grandparents did during the war. We never learned anything about what happened in our hometowns, in our streets, in our houses. And this is something I only became aware of when I left Germany to move abroad. And at this point, I've been living abroad for almost 20 years. And it was only when I became the German amongst non-Germans that I suddenly realized, wait, I don't actually know anything about this, what happened in my family. And this is when I went back to do the research that I did for the book. So I do think it's a common sentiment, but it's unfortunately also a sentiment that, I believe your roommate's sentiment was authentic, was genuine, her apology, but it's also, you can hide behind the collective. That's the problem with it, that, when everybody's guilty, no one is something that Hannah Arendt said once. And I think that's the problem with it, that if everybody has the same experience, you can hide behind it. Whereas if you ask yourself what happened in your own family, you approach the subject in a very different way.
In a very painful way for a lot of people, I would imagine. Yeah. As a professor, what are you seeing now from the younger generation as far as their interest in history or activism?
So I teach at the Parsons School of Design in New York City, so I can only speak to American students. my perspective from the last 15 years or so is that there has been a shift towards more political thinking. I noticed it first when Barack Obama was elected. Before then, I always had a sense that there was a certain sense of passivity and lack of personal engagement. And I think it's changed for the better, but I think there's also a sense of paralysis and helplessness about the state of the world. And I don't know, I think that's every educator's task, is to try to instill more strongly in their minds what we can do. And it's actually something I try to focus on a lot in my classes. I'm currently co-teaching a class that is dedicated to visual journalism and visual nonfiction. And we talked in one of the first classes, we talked about the power of illustration to change the way we think, but also the negative side to this, the power of illustration throughout centuries of propagating negative ideas, of excluding minorities. I mean, you know, there are many examples of anti-Semitic imagery that emerged in the Middle Ages that then later on the Nazis referred back to visually. So I want my students to be aware of the political power that we have as illustrators and to use the medium responsibly. But I obviously can't speak to the entirety of, you know, the younger American generation or the entire student body.
Well, just obviously in your experience, it's always good to get that individual perspective. So is that how the idea of a graphic edition of On Tyranny came about? Just using the power of imagery in combination with history?
I mean, to me, it definitely felt like a continuation of the previous work I had been doing. Before Belonging, I had worked on a series of short visual biographies about the lives of individuals who've experienced war, but people who are basically unknown because they came out of the wars neither as major perpetrators nor as heroes. And so their stories didn't appear deterring or you know, inspiring enough for us to listen to them or for them to be retold. So I focused on those people's lives because I think it's very important to explore the gray zone. You know, those lives that really represent most people's lives under any tyrannical regime, in order to understand how tyrannical regimes come to be and are being supported over the course of, you know, years and decades. And those short stories led to my book Belonging, and the historian Timothy Snyder read Belonging and kindly wrote a short commentary for the back of the book when it came out in 2018, and then followed up with me to ask me if I wanted to illustrate a new edition of his already existing book On Tyranny. So I was very excited to be approached. I was also a little bit, you know, nervous because obviously I deeply appreciate him as a historian and public thinker and speaker and commentator. But I also recognize that it's a very important task, and I decided to work on it with him, and I'm very grateful that I had the chance to do that.
So was part of the intent for the graphic edition to attract a different audience, perhaps a younger audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to kind of assess who might read a book before it's actually out there and published. I do think that was one of the thoughts that his publisher had initially. I don't know if Timothy and I think that way necessarily about the book. I think a book that's illustrated just engages anybody in a different way. I mean, the goal was for me to honor his text and to keep it at the center of the book, obviously, but also to reinvent the book by adding a separate visual layer that could add an additional emotional component to the text that could draw the reader in a different way. And I think illustrations can do that, and photographs too, with readers of any age. We tend to associate images, especially illustrations, with younger generations. And I think we sometimes underestimate how powerful the tool is also in the minds of us as adults. I mean, you know, when we watch films about, you know, the war or any war, we're so much more deeply affected than if we read, you know, facts in a school book, for instance. And I think the same is true for illustrations. I think they just have the power to draw us in, and in fact, that was the prime purpose of illustration before the advent of photography. Illustrations took on that role of informing those who couldn't read and conveying things that people thought were important at various times throughout history.
Well, like you said, it really, I mean, it makes this very emotional. I think that it's incredibly engaging, and some of the imagery you use is, I find, quite haunting. And what I just to go through your thought process a little bit, like sometimes you do illustrations, other times you have photos. So here we have a couple layout from a couple pages in the book where you use historical photos that sometimes you manipulate or color.
Yes, I like to mix different mediums. So for this book, I chose to use illustration and in some cases comic book drawings and photographs and also other graphic found objects and materials. And the reason for why I did this is because I wanted to convey that history can also be seen as an accumulation of individually experienced moments. So I like the idea of making it appear almost like a scrapbook of ideas, of memories, of experiences, of associations. And I also included materials from different centuries, from different cultures, in order to underline the fact that tyranny is timeless and universal. And so I used the photograph here on the left. I believe it's from the Library of Congress. I have a information at the back of the book that describes every single photograph, but I have to say I already forgot which archive I got this one from. But it shows members of the SS in Vienna putting up a sign in front of a Jewish shop as part of an attempt of boycotting Jewish shops and Jewish life in Vienna at the time. And the sign reads, "No penny to the Jew." And I juxtapose this image with a drawing of a woman who to me represents a Jewish woman, because in this paragraph, Timothy Snyder talks about how Jews disappeared while others stood by and did nothing. And what was important to me was, and I did this throughout the book, I put a lot of images in there that confront the reader directly. It was important for me that the reader feels like they're being looked at, that they're being spoken to, because Timothy Snyder's book is really a call for action. And I wanted to instill this idea in the reader that we all have a responsibility individually as well. And so I wanted both to draw a woman who looks directly at the reader on the right-hand page, but also search for a photograph of, that would show somebody looking directly in the camera, because to me, it's almost as if they're asking you, that they're giving you a choice. Are you going to support the tyrannical regime, or are you helping? And of course, this is a question that's universal. That's not only specific to the time of the Nazi regime, but also to what's happening at the moment anywhere in the world, really.
Oh, 100%. So the next image is from chapter 10, which is Believe in Truth. And it's one of the ones that I feel like when I was reading it, I kept going back to it, because we are just so inundated with misinformation and infographics that can tell a half truth and then the rest is a lie, but people, it spreads so quickly. So if we can just get that next slide pulled up, I just want to talk through it a little bit. It talks about Eugene Ionesco, so maybe we can talk about his relevance a little bit, and the illustrations, the upside down text and the face I found.
Yes, so on this page, Snyder quotes a personal experience by Ionesco, where he observed a number of university professors and students, intellectuals who slowly turned into Nazis. and the conversations he had with friends about that, and he calls it a symptom. And what I did a lot in this book is I wanted to integrate a certain playfulness, but a playfulness that's not really lighthearted, but that implies that we are all involved in these processes. We can be involved in the process of making our societies more democratic, but we can also be involved involuntarily or unconsciously in the creeping process of turning our countries into tyrannical regimes. And I wanted there to be an interactive aspect. It's also, we saw the cover earlier, it's also part of the cover where I have an origami paper head that's folded into a skull. And in the book, you can actually see that gradual transformation. The cover is based on a series of images within the book where you see a paramilitary or a soldier on one page, and it's a paper head, sorry. And then with every new page, you see the paper being folded bit by bit until it finally turns into a skull, which to me, this character represents tyranny in itself. And so again, I wanted this interactive element of, showing the reader that they can be and are sometimes involved in these processes. And in the case of this page, I had the publisher print the last paragraph upside down on purpose so that the reader would be forced to turn the book around. And when they do so, a new face emerges, which is, an old, as probably everybody knows, technique or an old visual tool that, this head gradually transforms into the face of a believer in Nazi ideology. And so the reader is actively involved in this process. So that was the idea behind this image.
But I mean, it's amazing to be able to make a book interactive like that. You're forcing the reader to change their perspective. I mean, it's.
Well, I was glad that the publisher went along with it. Because sometimes it's, I also split the text sometimes across the page or across images that makes it harder to read. And I know when you're not, a reader of visual books, that might appear irritating, but it also forces you to slow down the reading and to perhaps think more carefully about what you're reading. Maybe think again more carefully about Snyder's original text. And so I think sometimes disruption is a good thing. And you can do that in many visual ways as well.
I definitely found myself when I was reading it going back to some of those split texts and rereading it, because then the visual in the center really becomes a part of what you're reading. And then when you slow down, you retain a bit more information. So that's always helpful. So we, as I mentioned, currently surrounded in Holocaust denial and revisionism and inversion, and the Holocaust has become this universal, measuring stick for things that people don't like, or, inconveniences, or just things that are outrageous. Everything from mask mandates to Republicans or Democrats or vaccines or, abortions. Like I've eating meat. I've heard the so where do we draw the line with Holocaust comparisons?
I think you no historical situation should be directly compared to another. I think what can be compared, and I think that's what Timothy Snyder's book is so successful at, and his other books too, of course, is to compare the developments, to compare certain tendencies, to compare the way people speak, because language is often the root of violence. So I think to recognize early patterns that seem familiar, I think you can make those comparisons. But I think it's never a good idea to compare a certain president to Hitler, or a certain country to Nazi Germany, because I think it makes us come to the wrong conclusion, and that makes us vulnerable. because then we don't really listen carefully and observe carefully, and then we don't really know how to intervene. But obviously, yeah, when you mentioned Holocaust denial, I mean, it's a huge problem all over the world. And what I found so shocking most recently was this decision in Texas in October last year that probably many in the audience are aware of, that school teachers now have to, when they teach about the Holocaust, they also have to teach about Holocaust denial, as if it's a matter of choice. So not even acknowledging that there is such a thing as a historic fact is just deeply, deeply troubling. And as you say, it's in many areas of our society, whether it's about the coronavirus or other issues, that people just, yeah, distrust facts or don't know who to turn to anymore for the news, instead of just relying on, you know, those institutions that have proven to provide critical journalism. And it's really not so complicated, I think, but people are just confused, and I think feel like they're in a deep identity crisis, whether it's because of globalism or the environmental change or the political divide or the economic divide, or you know, the so-called migration crisis. People don't know who they are anymore, and they don't know what to believe anymore, and that's a dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a part of what we try to do, is just give students a story, something that, you know, that gives them a personal connection, something emotional to hold on to, because you're constantly being inundated with things that might be half truths or denial. Like teaching the other side of the Holocaust, or more recently, the banning of mouse, which, you know, most of the school board, you know, they had issue with profanity or nudity, you know, or they would upset the student. Well, that's okay. If we're talking about the Holocaust, it should be upsetting.
Yeah, and what's more important? I mean, that the students learn about the Holocaust with, you know, such a wonderful book, or that they read a word that's, you know, could be insulting to some. I mean, I think it's obviously more important that they learn about the Holocaust. So, yeah.
And I do have to make a note that the author of Mouse, Art Spiegelman, did praise the and the graphic version of On Tyranny, as he was saying that because he had never intended his graphic to become an educational tool, but this, even though it is, but this, you know, this book truly is. Now, chapter 18 talks about, it's called Being Calm When the Unthinkable Arrives. And so how do we do that? You know, after a massive anti-Semitic events, or right now, you know, a war, you know, Jewish people sometimes end up being political ping pong balls, with each side only calling things out when it's coming from the other. So how do we react the right way?
It's very difficult, and I think we're trying to learn. I mean, we are learning, I think, from Ukrainians in that regard at the moment as well. You know, I think it's a question I can't fully answer, because it depends so much on each individual situation. But I think one thing, obviously, I mean, it's easy for me to say, but I think that's the point of this article, this chapter, is to remain calm, not to panic, but and I think also because when you panic, you tend to believe in untruths and to make decisions that can go wrong for you. And I mean, what's so admirable at the moment to see with Ukrainians is their bravery and courage and true resistance. And, you know, it inspired me as a West German person too, Western European person. You know, they're saying that they're fighting for Europe's democracy, that this is a fight for democracy, not only in their own country, but it's, you know, it's recognizing that democracy is a process that we have to be involved in, that we can't take it for granted. And I think that's something that my generation and my parents' generation in Germany did. We took it for granted because we thought, well, it was so bad. And now we know how bad it was, and we're really educated about it, and we will make sure it's never happening again. And it could never happen again. And that's, of course, not true. It could happen anywhere again. And I think we need to recognize that we have to defend democracy actively, and we can't take it for granted. And again, we see that happening at the moment in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And there are some of those signs, as is discussed in the book here. You know, like you said, we can't take democracy for granted. It has to be a continual fight. And the book's basically a manual on how to keep it, how to keep what we have and how to make democracy stronger. So the themes of the book really speak the foundation of what we do as an organization too, the need to maintain vigilance and remain present to what is happening and remembering the deep connection between past and present. So before we head to the Q&A, please put your questions in now. What advice would you give us as an organization of 3Gs?
Oh God, I don't know if I should be giving you advice, but I think what you mentioned earlier about giving students, personal stories, I think that's a very, very important thing. As I said earlier, I think the personal component is really crucial, and it doesn't really matter if it's about, Nazi Germany or the Holocaust, or it could be, it's true also for the history of slavery, which, is not even institutionally recognized in America, I feel. But also we need to recognize that, again, we have a personal responsibility. For instance, going to archives to see if our family was involved in the history of slavery in some way, or, I think we need these personal stories, and we need these personal confrontations, because remembering collectively or institutionally is just not enough. Yeah, but I know you're doing that already with the personal stories that you're teaching, so I'm not sure that's advice for you.
Well, we try to get as many perspectives as we can, and yours is certainly valuable.
I mean, maybe another thing to add, what I think is important, and what I try to do with my book, Belonging, is to also look at the perspective of the perpetrator, because it's a very uncomfortable thing to do, and it might not be a popular thing to do, but I think it's very, very important, because we need to learn to understand how this could have happened, and how people could have voted for and supported somebody like Adolf Hitler for so long. And I think we can only do that if we also look at personal narratives of the perpetrators. I think it's something we shouldn't shy away from. And I'm always surprised of how little awareness there is of the German people from that time, and individual stories from that time, how much Germans are seen as one mass of people, and obviously the large majority voted for Hitler and supported him. But I think it's important that we look at individual lives and individual stories, so that we can dissect how this could have happened and make sure it's not happening again.
Well, I think what you're talking about, I know that that's probably not something that my grandparents as survivors could do, but being as 3Gs, we're removed enough that obviously it still can be difficult and emotional, but we're separated enough that we probably can try to look through that lens of the perpetrator and be like, how did you end up there? How did you allow yourself to get caught up in this and commit these acts? So I think that's very valuable advice. So thank you.
Thank you.
So going to our Q&A over here. Oh, this is something I was interested in too. The text of On Tyranny, is that your handwriting?
Thanks for the question. It's not, but it's a font that I developed that's based on my handwriting, because when I did Belonging, it's probably very blurry, but when I did Belonging, I hand lettered the American edition, which I will never do again for the rest of my life, because It's almost a 300-page book, and whenever there's one single change, you have to redo everything by hand. So for all of the foreign editions of Belonging, I decided to develop a font that I then used with the help of a designer in each country who published the book in a foreign language. And the same is currently happening with On Tyranny. I have one designer who I work with consistently, but also I work with a variety of designers in different countries who do the text layout for me, and I oversee the process. I'm very perfectionist when it comes to that. So each design, it takes several rounds of revisions until the foreign edition looks exactly the way that the original edition looks. And we had actually just finished the Ukrainian edition text layout not long ago, and my publisher there just told me that it was in the process of being printed when Russia attacked, and it's not clear what happened to the printer and whether the book is still in existence. It's just ironic to me that Putin is bombing a book about Putin. I mean, I'm sure there are many books about him that he's currently bombing, but yeah, that's just a very long answer to your question, but it's a font that's based on my hand lettering.
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't picked up the book yet, I mean, I was really studying the page because I'm like, no, this S looks different than this S, different than this one. Like
well,
but it's so precise.
The font has 4 variations for each letter. So the computer automatically chooses a different variation each time and cycles through each of the 4 variations so that it looks more organic.
And on that vein of creating those pages, can you share a little bit about your process of drafting a page? Do you sketch it out first? Do you have a general idea of the page before you begin, or does it appear more organically?
Thanks for the question. Well, it was, I'm very grateful to both Timothy and my publisher for letting me just work very intuitively, because I usually use sketches when I do editorial illustrations for newspapers and magazines, but for books and a book like this, I felt like it had to be more intuitive, because sometimes when I do sketches, the final page ends up looking too stiff. So I wanted a more playful approach. And so I did not do any sketches. I just went right into the finished page, hoping that, both Timothy and the publisher would be okay with it. And surprisingly and thankfully, they basically just waved everything through, and I just did whatever came into my mind, completely undisturbed during the lockdown and the pandemic in my little office. And what I did is I worked myself chronologically through the entire book, because I wanted to be with the reader in my mind. I wanted to know how they would perceive the book while they make their way through it chronologically. And so I basically had no idea what I was going to do for the next page until I was completely done with the previous page. And some pages took me longer than others because I couldn't immediately come up with an idea. I mean, I was under a lot of time pressure towards the end. I had 1.5 to 3 days per page. And sometimes, it took me a few days to come up with a suitable idea. And yeah, so it felt very spontaneous, and it also eerily felt like I was working on a visual diary, because a lot of things that Snyder had predicted in the book really came true in America, in the past year. And so I felt like I was illustrating the present.
Absolutely. So this next question, I'm gonna it's for the first time since World War II, Germany has committed arms in support of the Ukrainian military. Now, obviously, you cannot speak on behalf of Germans everywhere, but how do you feel about this, or in your experience with the people you know?
Yes, I know it's a difficult question, both here, when people think about and look at Germany. I mean, Germany is always watched. I see it always when I read the New York Times, that whenever there's a right-wing, extreme right-wing development, or the world reacts with concern, understandably, and Germany does too. But I do think that Germany, as it is, one of the Central European countries and one of the most economically strong countries in Europe, should take on more responsibility. I think, you know, again, I grew up in a generation, my parents and I grew up in a generation of, you know, really deep belief in pacifism. You know, I grew up thinking that being a soldier, there was nothing honorable about being a soldier. I mean, you know, we kind of didn't take the police seriously. We didn't take soldiers seriously. And, you know, I mean, I'm all for pacifism, but we see now that that's just not enough. You know, when we're looking at the Ukraine, and I feel like Germany just is not in the position to preserve democracy either in its own country, nor elsewhere to support its allies. And I just feel like that's not a responsible position to be in. And I think we need to invest more in that. And, you know, in an effort to pull Europe together as a democratic, you know, force. And so that's my own personal opinion. I know the opinions in Germany are divided. But I just think we have to take a stance, and we can't, you know, pacifism is a great thing, and that should always be the goal. But we also need to be able to defend democracy.
Absolutely. So on that vein, somebody asked if you could comment on the illustration that you published on Instagram of Putin on a horse.
Yes. Yeah, I went a little bit nuts today because I'm just so upset about the situation. Normally I don't post so many personal comments, but I put a lot of stuff on Instagram today, and it's this illustration from the chapter that you mentioned earlier called Be Calm When the Unthinkable Arrives. And it's basically, most of it is dedicated to Putin. And all the, you know, all the things that he has done in the past that have also led to what's happening now. I mean, obviously he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's been planning this for a long time. So this is an illustration where I try to portray him in the heroic way that he probably wants to be seen in. So it's meant ironically, and I was looking at traditional, you know, communist and also Chinese, but Russian and Chinese communist, you know, porcelain figurines that you can sometimes find, and try to, you know, evoke the same exaggerated heroism, and placing Putin, you know, with this famous scene of him riding on a horse, shirtless, seeing himself as the great conqueror, even though he's probably completely insecure. I imagine this would be a nice figurine to smash or throw down your balcony, but yeah, that's the story behind this one.
So this next question comes from someone who is appreciative that you brought up the U.S.'s lack of acknowledgement and lack of addressing slavery. And they were wondering if you have any opinions as to why we, speaking as an American, as a nation, refuse to acknowledge this, if you think we ever will. And do you think that our current post-truth political cultural situation is a result of this lack of acknowledgement and acceptance of our collective support of slavery?
I think it's difficult for me to say as a European. I mean, I'm American now too, so I see it also as my responsibility, which is why I mean, it's just a gesture really, but I try to address the subject of slavery a little bit, you know, on this page in On Tyranny, where I show a photograph of two formerly enslaved persons who again look into the camera, because it was important to me that the reader feels challenged to think about how they can combat racism, contemporary racism. So I don't know. I mean, you know, the big difference, I think, between Germany and the United States in terms of, you know, national identity and how we think about national identity in our histories is that as a German, I grew up, you know, just seeing my country in a very, very critical light. There was no pride, there was no patriotism. There was no national anthem. I still don't know the lyrics of the national anthem by heart. And in America, I think the opposite is true, that because it's a country of immigrants, this is something that Germans don't understand. because it's a country of immigrants, you had to have this common denominator. You had to create this myth of how you came to be, because everybody who comes here to make a new life, you know, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what their religion is, and so forth, has to fit into this myth, has to believe in it, commit to it. Otherwise, the country would fall apart. I mean, I think it's probably one of the few countries in the world that has been able to exist more or less peacefully. I mean, we know that there are tensions and divisions, but you know, for such a long time, because there is this mutual belief. And I think that is the reason for why these narratives are taught in schools and why they are, you know, quite uncritical, at least one of the reasons. But again, I'm not an American, so this is just a very European perspective, perhaps. And I think every country, and also in the United States, people are afraid that if they look at their country's histories from a critical angle, they can't love their country. And this is, it's something I don't understand, because it isn't a contradiction. I mean, it is a contradiction to Germans too, because Germans tend to not say things like, I love Germany. I mean, myself included, I have a very hard time saying that. But I think we should be able to embrace and celebrate our culture, and at the same time, always constantly and consistently look back at its troubled past. Because to me, the definition of patriotism is that you have to embrace your country in its entirety. You have to embrace your history in its entirety. You have to confront it. You can't just highlight the nice moments of your history. You have to embrace all of it. You have to confront all of it. And you have to also embrace the entirety of the people that live in your country. You can't just make this a place that's exclusive for one particular kind of person or kind of thinking, way of thinking. And this is when, you know, certain people would call others un-American just because they have another opinion. And so, yeah, I think it's a difficult thing for people to think that they can look back critically and at the same time embrace and love their country. But yeah, it shouldn't be.
Well, you know, like really you said, if I love my country, don't I want it to be the best possible place for everybody? So I would argue that it's more patriotic to want to fix what is wrong than to just pretend that everything is wonderful for everybody. Exactly. You know, there's definitely a lot of people here who take that. We went a little extra with the pride that we use to unify us. I've definitely heard from people that come over to the US to visit. They're always struck by how many American flags they are everywhere. That's not something that exists in a lot of places, you know, on people's front lawns and things like that.
And of course, people have flags for different reasons, but I do think that for some people, it's something that they adopt when they become Americans, you know, because they want to belong. I mean, they come here hoping to belong, and this is a way of committing, perhaps. But I know there are also, you know, other reasons for displaying the flag.
Oh, somebody just said that your image of Putin on a horse, that you made them smile, and so that's so true about Putin, and kudos.
Thank you.
What are you currently working on?
I'm working on many ideas. I haven't really, you know, begun an actual new project, but I have several ideas for new visual nonfiction projects that talk about war, not necessarily the Second World War, not necessarily about Germany. So at the moment, I'm in the process of juggling in my head a few different things that I would like to do. One thing that I'd like to expand on is both in On Tyranny and Belonging. I published a lot of photographs and objects that I found at flea markets across Germany. This is one example on the title page. This is a photograph that I found in an antique shop in West Berlin that was amongst other loose photographs that belonged to a German soldier from the Second World War. And it shows a man with a beard wearing an armband, and it's, even though it wasn't labeled, it's possible and yeah, it's possible that this is a Jewish man who was photographed during the German invasion in Poland. And I continue to go to flea markets across Germany and continue to be surprised and deeply moved by certain photographs and objects that I find there that are personal things that belong to individuals who lived through that time. And for me, it's really an attempt of getting a more visceral understanding of that time, of what it meant to be German at that time. I'm not interested in propaganda material. I'm interested in personal artifacts. And I have amassed quite a lot of them, partly because I know they can get into the wrong hands, meaning, you know, there are collectors all over the world who collect Nazi-themed items for the wrong reasons, you know, to express their extreme right-wing ideologies. And I think these items belong in archives, but I would like to do something with them at some point, because I think they tell very personal stories about the war that, again, we should look at in order to understand how this could have happened.
Absolutely. Well, they give you something tangible. I know my family, we're friends and relatives in the community in Krakow, Poland. Like they buried things in graves in the cemetery, and after many years, my grandparents went back and they dug some of these things up and slightly illegally smuggled them into the US. So like I have a piece of a buried Talmud, and I have a Kiddush cup, and it's like, you know, poor man's tin Kiddush cup, but it was it has dates on it. It was somebody's wedding cup that we have, and we don't know if they survived or where they are, but having that item, I feel like, is very powerful.
And also the act of unburying it is so symbolic in a way. I mean, it's that sounds fascinating.
So the last question before we wrap up talks about young adults are being described now as being very anxious and perceptive, and that books like yours give comfort as they can normalize why they feel this way. Do you think about your audience and try to see through their eyes as you draw and illustrate?
Thanks for the question. I mean, I agree with your observation. A lot of my students, I think, share these kind of feelings, and it's, you know, it's very troubling to see. And I can't say I had a particular audience in mind when I illustrated this book. To me, it was really like a dialogue with Timothy, you know, an inner dialogue. I had his voice in my head, and I tried to make sense of it as an artist, basically, for myself. And I'm glad to see that it because that's the thing with, you know, when you're a writer or an illustrator, you just don't know how anything that you do will communicate, or if it will communicate. So I didn't have an audience in mind, but I agree with you, at least, you know, in terms of the writing of On Tyranny, that it is a very, it can give you strength, because even though it highlights the dangers, it also gives you hope. And I think that's the great thing about the work that Timothy does, is that I think in the end it is hopeful, because he's appealing to us to engage and to resist and to recognize early patterns of tyranny. And that is something we can cling to. And that makes us feel like we have agency. And when you feel like you have agency, you feel stronger and less afraid.
Yeah, I 100% agree, because you know, sometimes reading text like this, it's so heavy, and it doesn't leave you feeling hopeless. You can, you know, it gives you tangible things to do and to think about, and the fight to save democracy.
Yeah.
So I just want to give Nora a big thank you so much for speaking with us today. The link to purchase On Tyranny is located in the chat. There's also going to be a follow-up email that's sent out tomorrow, and the link will be in there as well. And we hope that you'll consider making a gift to 3GNY so we can continue to provide you programming like this, and to get our We Do speakers in schools. Also, if you have any connections with any educators or institutions and would like our speakers to present, please reach out. We speakers that are ready to present either in person or virtually. And we are expanding, so not just in New York, but other places as well. And thank you again for taking the time to be with us, Nora, and thank you to everyone. Oh, somebody just said they just ordered 7 books in German for their cousins in Germany. That's amazing.
Yes,
So
thank
thank you so much, all of you, for tuning in and being with us this evening, and for your continued support. Good night.
Thanks so much.